Hello and welcome to Author in Your Classroom from Plazoom. My name is Helen Mully, and the author joining us in your classroom, or wherever you're listening for this episode, has actually been a favourite of mine for quite a while now. He has this incredible knack for telling really quite tough and challenging stories in a way that keeps you as the reader completely gripped, but also somehow strangely reassured about the world and the people who live in it. In the past, he's often written for young people who are a little bit older than our listeners tend to be, but his latest book, Now or Never, is definitely one that belongs in every Key Stage 2 library, and I am really looking forward to talking about it today. Welcome to the podcast, Bali Rai.
Hi, nice to be here.
I'm very glad you're here. So, Bali, I said in my introduction that you tell or often tell tough and challenging stories. Now, I know that's not the only kind of storytelling you do, but it is kind of what I connect with you. So I suppose what I'm interested in finding out is, how do you as a writer choose what kind of stories to tell?
To begin with, it was always things that I'd always wanted to write. So some of my earlier stuff, which was much more teenage, as you said, it was subject matter that I wanted to explore. But for things like Now or Never, there is a theme, and the theme all the way through my career, no matter what I write, tends to be picking up unheard voices or unheard stories.
Yeah.
So when Now or Never appeared, and it was this Voices series that Tony Bradman and Scholastic were talking about, the publisher, it worked for me immediately because it's what I've been doing my entire career.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And you say your entire career, but I've been reading some other interviews with you, and you started inventing stories when you were really quite young, didn't you?
Yeah, I was probably 7. It's when I kind of fell in love with, I loved non-fiction as a reader to begin with and didn't really do fiction. And then I fell in love with James and the Giant Peach by Roald Dahl. Read it, a teacher read us story time every day, and it was the first fiction book I really enjoyed. So after that, stories about zombie fish flying around the classroom eating the kids, things like that.
I was going to ask you what kind of stories you were writing when you were 7 or 8, and it was zombie fish.
Yeah, I don't know why. I just started putting my friends into the story and my teachers. It wasn't. I didn't think at the age of 7, obviously, I'm going to write a story about the real world. I just used the people around me. And it's something I've always done. It was a lot of fun as well.
It's a really natural thing for a writer, isn't it? I think it goes back to that whole write what you know business that people are always saying to, especially to young writers, and that does include grabbing characters who are in your real life and putting them in these crazy fictional situations. Yeah,
it's really good practice as well. I mean, I think you can also write about things you don't know. I think it really limits you to say, but if you're practicing as a writer, if you're a young writer, writing about the world, or using your friends as characters, your family, is actually a really good way to practice it. It was a tip that a fellow writer, Robert Swindells, gave me many, many years ago when I first started, about the idea that if you wanted to write about a chair, you wouldn't have to invent a chair. You know what a chair looks like, so just use a chair, and stick to your imaginative, your creative stuff is the stuff that really kind of holds the story together, the emotional arcs and the journey and the magic and all the rest of it. But if you need a tree, why invent a tree? Just use a tree that look out the window.
That makes such a lot of sense. But the 7 or 8 year old Bali didn't think to himself, when I grow up, I'm going to write books and be published and visit schools and talk about my books. So what happened to your path in between now and then? How did you end up where you are now?
It was something that I think the first time I really thought about it as a career was when Sue Townsend's Adrian Mole book came out, the first one, because Sue was from Leicester. Sadly, is no longer with us, and she was my idol. She was like my true role model. I loved Dahl and C.S. Lewis and all kinds of people, Douglas Adams, loved reading, but she was writing about Leicester and about the people of Leicester, and it was something that, and she was just, it's a regular woman from a regular sort of background, and I just thought, well, if she can do it, I can. So I had that dream, but I didn't really do anything with it. I was just, the usual sort of route through school, college, university. I've got a degree in politics. I started writing and started thinking about it, and it was eventually my first novel, An Arranged Marriage for Teenagers, that I showed to a lady I know whose mum is a literary agent. And she just sort of looked at it and went, yeah, it's quite good, but it needs a lot of work, which was very true. 7 edits.
And you were prepared to go and put that work in?
Yeah, I think all the authors you speak to, it doesn't matter how successful they are. I mean, I'm talking about actual authors that write their books here. You have to... Yeah. The hard work has to be there. It doesn't matter what you do. If you're young and you're thinking about a career as a doctor and nurse, my eldest is nearly completed her training as a nurse. It's hard work. You've got to be willing to put that hard work in.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been reading your latest book, Now or Never, which, as you say, is part of the Voices series, in which authors are telling real stories from history, but seen from the viewpoint of peoples whose voices aren't usually heard.
Yeah.
So could you tell us a little bit about whose voice we're hearing in Now or Never, and why that's the story you wanted to tell?
Yeah, the central character is called Fazal Khan, and I sort of reworked the story so that he'd be younger to fit the narrative. So he leaves home to follow in the footsteps of his grandfather, who fought as a Commonwealth soldier in World War One, and he's doing the same in World War Two. So he ends up with the Royal Indian Army Service Corps, who were, in this case, Company 32, were leading mules and horses, and he ends up in Marseille. And then in France, in the run-up to Operation Dynamo, what popularly known as Dunkirk, and he is basically a young Indian man who is caught up in this war and caught up in the sort of whole sort of. When he starts, he's very naive. He thinks about war as something that's about bravery and camaraderie and all the rest of those things. And it's, as he ends up in France, it's about how his experiences change the way he feels. But it's essentially, it sounds weird, but he's following his dream at the start. And these were real characters. Company 32 really existed. Captain Ashdown, the guy leading Company 32, was a real character. He had a famous politician for a son, Paddy Ashdown. So, it was about following the characters that existed and telling a story that hadn't been told, because the story is there. You just have to search really, really hard for it, which is what I had to do.
Yes, and that was amazing to me, because this was an aspect of Dunkirk, even of the war itself, that I didn't know much about, and I consider myself a reasonably well-read, well-taught person, and I certainly didn't know about Paddy Ashdown's father.
Yeah,
I'm not going to spoil the story, but he's an incredible character. It's just extraordinary. And so reading this, for me, knowing that it was something true that happened, but had been sort of factored out of the way that I saw that scene happening, including, on the big screen, and we might talk about that a bit more later as well. Mm-hmm. It was really moving, and it was really powerful. And what I would really, really like, Bali, if that's okay, is if you could share an extract from the book with our listeners, so they can get a feel for the writing and a snapshot of the story. So I'm just going to pause for a moment while you get your book and turn to the right page. And then, if it's okay, I'll ask you to read for us from Now or Never, a Dunkirk story. Welcome back to Author in Your Classroom with our guest today, Bali Rai. Bali, you're going to read to us now from your book, Now or Never. Before you start, would you mind just explaining a little bit about what's been happening in the story so far, so that our listeners can properly picture the scene?
Yeah, Company 32, along with Fazal Khan, his friends, Captain John Ashdown, they've made their way from India to Marseille on a boat. The mules and the men have disembarked, and they begin their journey in France, obviously in the south, and then work their way north to try and repel the Nazi invasion of France. The Nazis famously broke through the impenetrable Maginot Line. So they're heading north, and at the point at which the story where I'm going to read, that they've reached Dunkirk and they are sort of along the coastal path and they're heading into Dunkirk, and they're really unsure of their future. They're really unsure of what's going to happen with the mules. And Fazal has had his dreams, his idea of what it would be like have been, they've been dashed. He's beginning to question everything that he sees around him and his role, which is a very difficult thing for him to do, because he's driven by a sense of integrity and honor, that you always do the right thing. In fact, the entire company they have a duty to fulfill, and they're beginning to question that duty and whether it's the right thing. With nothing else to do, we sat on the road and waited. Sergeant Buckingham walked up and down the lines, checking on us and issuing nonsensical orders about staying put and not causing a fuss. None of the men were complaining, even though we had every right to. And with nowhere to go, what else could we do but sit and wait? Buckingham seemed drunk again and took several swigs from a hip flask until it ran dry. He cursed and flung it aside before muttering to himself. Part of me had grown to hate the sergeant, but I couldn't help remembering that his father had died at the Somme. Perhaps this explained his hatred and anger, and perhaps that gave him some semblance of an excuse for his behaviour. Each of us was frightened and weary, and each of us coped with our stresses in particular ways. It was not for me to judge my sergeant, but I could not help disliking him nonetheless. He had insulted my country, my culture, and my honour one too many times. Before us lay the open sea, grey and choppy and filling the air with saltiness. From the road, a wide bank led steeply down onto the narrow beach, also crammed with troops. I nudged Mush, who was sitting with his eyes closed, deep in thought. The beach is not very wide, I told him. He opened his eyes and took in the scene. It's high tide, he told me. The sea will retreat this evening and the beach will widen then. Tides? Mush shook his head like a slightly disappointed teacher. The sea moves in and out with the tides, he explained. You must remember that from our journey to Marseille. No, I admitted. I was too busy dreaming about what we might see in France, or tending to the mules. You mean they didn't teach you about tides at your fancy school, said Mush. No, they didn't, I replied. He said. You're very stupid for somebody so clever. And you're very ugly, I joked. We make a good team, brother. He punched my shoulder playfully, closed his eyes and went back to daydreaming. But not for very long. A shout went up and then dive bombers appeared to the east. They sped along the coastline, homing in on our position like angry hornets in late summer. Sergeant Buckingham blew his whistle and we ran towards the town itself, desperate to avoid the attack. The sands erupted with bombs and gunfire as our troops tried to escape. Many were cut down where they sat, and others as they ran. Some charged into the sea, eager to escape death, but it did no good. The water did not prevent the bullets from hitting their mark. The Stuckers made 3 passes, and each time they took more lives. And then they were gone as quickly as they'd arrived. Clouds of smoke and dust polluted the air, and the sand turned red where the casualties were greatest. Screaming and groaning filled my ears, then shouting and calling for medics. 2 ambulances made their way towards us, but their progress was slow because the area around the road was jam-packed with angry and panicked men. A few of my comrades began to clear a path, but a gang of white soldiers grew angry and a fight broke out. Captain Morrow and 2 other officers rushed to calm things down, and in all of the madness, the wounded continued to suffer. It's every man for himself and no mistake, said a British private close by. I bet those officers were enjoying a nice cuppa while we sat in the open. Stands to reason, don't it, said another. 1 rule for them, another rule for us, blinking toffs. A few murmurs became shouts, and I thought the private and his friends might start a riot. But then Sergeant Buckingham fired his pistol into the air. Calm down, he screamed. That is an order.
Wow. I honestly, I think in that short extract, you've got pretty much everything that a piece of really dramatic writing should have. And by that, I don't mean a piece of melodramatic writing. I mean a piece of writing that puts you right in the middle of the action. So you see it, you hear it, you smell it, and you feel it. Honestly, you feel like you're right in the middle of what's going on as a reader or a listener. At the same time, you're really connected to what the narrator is feeling as well, the way that Fazal is experiencing this. How do you get that balance as a writer? How do you keep it so vivid and dramatic, but also have this internal narrative going on?
I tend to start, and it's kind of another bit of advice I give to all writers, but particularly young ones. I start with an emotional arc. So when I began this story, obviously the history and the facts are really important, but the starting point for me was Fazal's emotional state when he begins the story and the journey he goes on. So as I write and I'm taking in the facts and I'm kind of developing the plot line in a physical sense, where are they going? What's going on? What actually happened on that day? What did the town look like? It becomes less important to me than how he feels about it, because stories are driven by emotion. They're driven by drama, and drama comes from emotion. And without that, you just have a series of incidents that really don't connect in any sort of empathic way with readers. So I always say to young people, pick an emotion. Sadness, anger, happiness, whatever, and then explore that. Have your character explore that and talk about that, and then the story will come, because that's where the story comes from. And it was kind of easy to do in a way, because I had such a connection with Fazal and with the rest of the men the minute I started learning about them, because I was so sad that this story hadn't been told. And also, if I'm honest, I was quite angry that this story wasn't as widely known as it should have been. So, those two things drove it. And then it's about getting the balance right. And if you follow the emotions, you get the balance right.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned empathy, because one moment in that scene stands out particularly for me in an emotional sense, which is when Fazal is thinking about Sergeant Buckingham, who's a horrible character. He's almost a caricature, isn't he, with his coldness and his meanness and his spite. And Fazal has every reason to loathe him. And then you have him pause and think, oh, hang on a minute, this is a man whose father died the last time we all went to war, and perhaps that's influenced his behaviour. And he doesn't let him off the hook. He doesn't say, well, that means he's allowed to be a horrible person. But it takes him closer to understanding him. And I just wonder how important it was for you to have that empathy going in that direction as well as you wrote the story.
It became really important, because I didn't want... Buckingham is a horrible character, but I've always said this, my experience growing up in the UK, I'm nearly 50, and experiencing racial prejudice, the people who have any kind of prejudice, they learn that prejudice, so or they develop it for a reason. And it's all very well shouting at people who are prejudiced, racist, whatever, but you're not going to change their minds by shouting at them. So for me, the starting point is always trying to understand the character and why they do what they do, and then fairness. So, you don't have to like Buckingham as a character, but it's unfair if you don't understand why he's so angry, why he's constantly drunk, all the rest of it. I really worried about putting that in because of the age range of the readership, but I wanted it to be really honest. And I often think we shy away from talking to our younger readers about stuff like this when they're actually perfectly capable of taking that in and understanding it. And I don't want the book to be an exercise in young people going, oh, we hate Buckingham and the other officers and we love like Fazal and his. It's about them thinking for themselves and working out for themselves why people do what they do and where that comes from. And it was really important. Buckingham, Morrow up to a point, but obviously John Ashdown in a huge way, because he's such an amazing character. But I wanted to have that balance. I think writing without balance, for me, I can't do it. It doesn't work. I did it a lot when I was younger with my earlier stuff. And then I'd read it back and go, I haven't been particularly fair on that character. So I think stories are better when you understand people's motives and why they do what they do.
Yes, absolutely. When you can't start at the beginning and have your character list and say these are the baddies and these are the goodies. I think a sign of a really well-told story is that there's baddies and the goodies get just a little bit smushed up. You may like some of them more than others, but it's never as simple as baddies and goodies.
Always depends on the genre. If you're doing good versus evil, then fair enough if it's like a funny spy type thing. But for something like war, they have to be there. Those layers have to be there.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I'm interested in this idea about telling unheard stories from history. And I'm particularly interested in this idea of how we choose which voices we share, and on top of that, how we can be sure that we're sharing them as authentically as possible. So I'm just mindful, we spoke to Benjamin Zephaniah in a previous episode of Author in Your Classroom. One thing that he said to all the listeners was, look, if we don't tell our own stories, then someone else is likely to tell them for us. That's kind of what you're doing with Now or Never. That's quite a responsibility, isn't it?
Yeah, it feels like it. I mean, I know exactly where Benjamin's coming from with that. There is, for a long time, and I've been doing this 20 years, he's been doing it a little bit longer, Mallory Blackman for way longer. But we've spoken about this, the three of us, in person before. I know both of those writers, and you start doing it because the stories aren't there, and then you feel a sense of responsibility. But at the same time, people will then turn around to you and go, "Oh, do you feel that you have the responsibility to do it?" I don't have to do it. It's same with Benjamin, same with Mallory, whoever. We choose as writers to tell the stories we tell. And for me, it was more about the fact that there are young people who are going to be listening, who learn history. My little girl is 7, they learn history, but we're only telling them certain parts of it. And with Dunkirk, particularly, the idea that it was just a whole load of white soldiers on a beach, and, there were hardly any women, and there were no Indian troops, there were no Senegalese, West African, French troops defending the town. All of these things happened, but they're all missing from things like the 2017 film. There were hardly any women in that story, yet all the nurses would have been female, because back then there were no male nurses.
Yeah.
So it's about telling the story as telling the history as a more rounded thing, and being a lot more honest about it. And that feels like a responsibility, because people, based on my social media when this came out, some people don't like that and they like to shout at you about it. But there you go.
Well, then the rest of us just love the idea that we can read a really brilliant, entertaining book, but also learn something really important, and you and I are pretty much of an age, and I certainly learned something by the time I finished it. And I also, it made me want to go out and tell other people, did you know this thing? And I think that's a really profoundly important thing. So thank you for that.
You're very welcome. Like I said, I did exactly the same thing as you with the history. When I was learning it, I was really annoyed with myself for not knowing it already, because I think I'm well read, and I think I'm a history buff. I love history, always have done. But I found myself doing the same. I was messaging friends going, you're not going to believe this. Look what I've just learned. But it's there. This stuff is there. It's just sad that we have to search for it. It should be there for us to access. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it should. And it's books like this that help us step in that direction, I think, which is great. I can't believe it, but we're running out of time, and I have another chunk of questions to ask you. In fact, I've got a bit of a surprise for you, I think, because some of our listeners from Bolton School Junior Boys have been reading Now or Never as part of their Remembrance Book Club, using resources developed by the National Literacy Trust, working with the Royal British Legion. And they've sent in some questions.
Oh, wow. Awesome.
That they would love you to answer live, if that's okay.
I'd love to. I was supposed to go and visit them, I think, and it had to be cancelled. So, yeah, or certainly do a virtual thing or something. There was something that was going to happen that didn't happen. So, yeah, that'd be great.
Oh, fantastic. Well, in which case, I'm just going to pause for a little bit while I get that organised. Before I do, though, can I just remind parents and teachers listening that we do produce a free resources pack to go with every episode of Author in Your Classroom, so that children can take what they're listening and feed it into their own writing. You can download it from plazoom.com, and details are in the episode notes, as are details of the National Literacy Trust's Remembrance Book Club resources. So, as I say, I will pause the recording for a moment while everyone takes that in, and then we'll be back for the real interrogation. Welcome back to Author in Your Classroom with today's guest, Bali Rai. Okay, Bali, so as I explained, these next few questions have been sent in to us from pupils at Bolton School Junior Boys who have been reading Now or Never as part of their Remembrance Book Club. And the first question is from Saif, who asks, is there a character you feel you relate to yourself?
Not so much myself. There are elements of my sort of way of thinking about the world in Fazal. Fazal is obviously from an Islamic background. My family is Sikh, but the Punjabi culture, heritage, that northern Indian, India as it was then, it's obviously modern day Pakistan now, Rawalpindi. There is that connection about the concept of having a hukam hai, they call it, having a duty. So you're given a duty and you're honor bound to fulfill that. That's something that Punjabi people and Punjabi descended people have within their kind of psyche. It's a real sort of trait. So there are elements of that, but it was probably the first story in a long time with a male protagonist where it wasn't really me. I was really very much concentrating on the character themselves. I often tend to leave bits of myself in lots of my male protagonists, even some of my female ones, in terms of worldview. But no, I wanted it to be about Fazal and Hafazal and Fazal's journey. And obviously there was plenty for me to go on. Yeah, it's a really good question, that, because I tend to do that quite a lot.
Well, Adar has a great question as well. I love this one, which is, how did you know when your story was finished?
Oh,
I wonder how writers ever know when their story is finished.
Yeah, Adar, that's a brilliant question. I didn't, to be honest. I sort of knew what was going to happen, because I know that he has to leave and get to Marseille. I know they have to end up on the beaches at Dunkirk. I knew the history and what happened after that, and I don't want to ruin it for anybody. But we know they're going to end up at Dunkirk. It's a Dunkirk story. And I kind of tried to find a place where I could tie it up for this, because it's historically, so that it's based on historical facts. I didn't want to have some kind of open-ended story. I wanted the readers to know sort of where they ended up, but also leave it a little bit open. So there is again, I won't ruin it for anybody, but there was a natural point at which the story ends, and I decided to go with that, which is a timeline thing, historical timeline. So one of the few points at which I actually stuck to the history. I stuck to the facts, but I let a lot of the detail disappear so I could tell a better story. Good question, though.
I suppose, kind of tying into that, Tejas wonders, how long did it take you to write?
Oh,
I don't know if he's including research in that, but I think you probably have to, don't you?
Yeah, I always separate the two. So research-wise, probably 6 months on and off from the initial conversation with the series editor to getting the first draft in and editing it. Mm-hmm. And within those 6 months, the writing of the first draft didn't take very long at all. It took me about a week. But I just worked on it every day, because I got into the story from the moment it was mentioned and I started researching it. So sitting down to write it, when I found the time, I just sat down and I started writing it. So just over a week, probably 7-8 days in total for the first draft. I mean, that's, obviously for the listeners, the teachers will know this, that the first draft doesn't get published. It's just, this is get the story down and then work on it. But yeah, about 7-8 days for the writing.
Okay. Well, I think we've got time for just one more question, and this one comes from Will, and he wants to know whether you had any family members in the war, or did any family members inspire you with characters in the book?
My family history is very sketchy, so I know up to a point that on my father's side there were very few people who were involved. They were farming, they were involved with the farming. My father's village produced 2 Indian revolutionaries who were fighting against British rule. On my mum's side, my mum's uncle, ended up in the merchant navy, and he was definitely involved, but there's no real history of that. And he ended up after the war living in Fiji. So there's a Fijian side potentially to our kind of wider family that we know nothing about. So yeah, it's all a bit sketchy on my mum's side. On my father's side, no, they were all farmers, and some of the village, Moranwali it's called, was quite a rebellious village. I don't think anyone would have gone to fight for king and country. I think they were more likely to fight against king and country. And this is, again, these are stories that are there that need to be told, that are part of our history. It's something I need to look into.
I was just about to say that. There's another story there for sure.
Oh, there's a few. There are always stories to be told. There are always untold voices, which is why it's such a privilege to be allowed the space and the platform in order to explore those.
Absolutely. So there you go, boys, and all our listeners. I hope you found those answers interesting. I know I did, and they were really great questions too. Fantastic. I am slightly worried that those boys are after my job, so I'm thinking, this is not something that I'm going to make a regular feature on the podcast. But that does really bring us to the end of our time together, Bali. It's been a joy and an education speaking with you. So thank you very, very much for being here.
Thank you very much. It's been a real privilege and great questions.
And thank you also to all our listeners, wherever you are. We'll be back soon with another inspirational author, and I cannot wait. Bye. Author in Your Classroom is brought to you by Plazoom, where we are passionate about making great literacy lessons easy with inspiring, ready-to-go resources created by teachers to cover the whole of the primary curriculum. So, whether you're a teacher desperate for SATs revision that pupils will actually enjoy, a parent just as baffled by fronted adverbials as your child, or anyone looking for fun ways to keep children reading and writing during the summer holidays, we've got hundreds of brilliant ideas to explore. Take a look for yourself at plazoom.com, where you can sign up to our newsletter and be the first to find out about our special offers and the new resources that are added to the site every single week. Every episode of Author in Your Classroom is packed with writing advice and inspiration from some of the world's best-loved children's writers. Plus, there are free activities and worksheets based on each author's work to spark children's imagination on plazoom.com. Just check the episode notes for links and more. You can subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts. We want to reach as many pupils in as many classrooms as possible, so please do give us a rating or a review, but above all, tell your colleagues about us and help spread the word. We know that a love of reading opens doors, not just to success at school and beyond, but to a lifetime of excitement, adventure and discovery. Let us help you make it happen with Author in Your Classroom and Plazoom.